In the summer of 1800, in the bustling heart of Paris, the city was alive with tension and a restless energy that came in the wake of the French Revolution and the ongoing campaigns of Napoleon's army. The ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality still lingered in the air. But beneath those lofty words, there existed a harsher reality. France was extending its power abroad, fighting to cement its control in distant lands, particularly in Egypt and the Middle East. That foreign campaign had been marked by both grand ambition and humiliating defeat. One man, an outsider in Paris, would bring the ripples of the conflict straight into the French capital. His name was Suleiman al Halabi, a young theology student from Aleppo, who would commit an act that stunned the empire, and whose punishment would remind the world of just how cruelly justice could be administered, even in an age that considered itself modern and enlightened. Suleiman al Halabi was born in 1777 in Aleppo, a city that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. He was not from a family of soldiers or revolutionaries, but rather from a humble background. His father sold butter and ghee, while young Suleiman dedicated himself to religious studies. His early life gave no indication that he would one day become infamous in European history. Yet history often takes unexpected turns. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, a campaign meant to expand French influence in the Middle East and threaten Britain's position in India. Although Napoleon eventually abandoned his Egyptian expedition, the French presence lingered under the command of General Jean-Baptiste Kléber, a celebrated and skilled military leader. Kléber's presence in Egypt stirred resentment among the local population, who viewed the French as intruders and oppressors. Suleiman, studying in Cairo at the time, was swept into this resentment. His religious teachers encouraged resistance against the occupiers, and he volunteered for a mission that would alter the course of his life. In June of 1800, Suleiman traveled to Paris, a foreigner in a strange land, but with a single mission burning in his heart: the assassination of Kléber. Kléber had returned to Paris briefly and was living at his residence in the Rue d'Alange. For days, Suleiman stalked him quietly, unnoticed by the soldiers and officials who guarded the general's home. On June 14, 1800, his opportunity arrived. Disguised as a beggar, he approached Kléber's garden. The general, unaware of the danger, walked calmly among his plants. Suddenly, Suleiman leapt forward and drove a dagger into Kléber's chest. The attack was frenzied and merciless. He stabbed the general multiple times until his body collapsed to the ground. Kléber, one of France's great military minds, was dead within moments, felled not by an army, but by the hand of a determined theology student. Paris erupted in shock. The assassination was not only a brutal crime, but also a political affront. How could an outsider, a man with no connection to France, come to its capital and kill one of its heroes? The authorities quickly apprehended Suleiman, who made little effort to hide his role. His interrogation was swift and merciless. The French judicial system was determined to make an example of him. They interrogated him not only with words, but also with torture. His right hand, the hand that had wielded the dagger, was burned with searing iron until it was charred to the bone. The purpose was not just punishment, but humiliation and symbolic justice. That hand, which had struck down a French general, would be destroyed before the eyes of those who demanded vengeance. But burning his hand was only the beginning. The court had decided on a punishment that was ancient, savage, and designed to terrorize anyone who might think of repeating such a crime. Suleiman was condemned to death by impalement. Even in 1800, when guillotines had become the instrument of swift revolutionary justice, impalement was a shocking choice. It was a method more often associated with medieval brutality or Eastern despots, not with the so-called enlightened age of France. Yet the court insisted, for nothing less than a spectacle of horror would satisfy their thirst for revenge. On the day of execution, a vast crowd gathered in Paris. Public executions were still one of the most anticipated spectacles of the time. drawing thousands who craved both entertainment and moral instruction from the suffering of others. But this day promised something beyond the ordinary. A guillotine, quick and efficient, could end a life in seconds, but impalement was slow, agonizing, and intended to stretch death over many hours. The crowd buzzed with curiosity, some repelled, but many eager to witness the gruesome fate of the foreign assassin. Suleiman was brought forward under heavy guard. His appearance shocked those who saw him closely. His right hand was charred and blackened, hanging uselessly at his side after the brutal torture. His face was marked with exhaustion, but his eyes still carried defiance. He had committed his act with conviction, and even now, facing a death so cruel, he refused to beg for mercy. Bound tightly, he was placed before the executioner, a long iron spike standing upright, gleaming ominously in the sunlight. The spike was 9 feet tall, sharpened to a deadly point, and firmly anchored in the ground. It awaited its victim like a silent predator. The executioners forced Suleiman onto the spike. The point was driven into his rectum, slowly and with calculated precision. The agony he must have felt in the instant is beyond imagination. His body convulsed as the iron pierced upward, ripping through muscle and organs, working its way through his torso. The goal was not to kill him instantly, but to let the spike travel carefully through his body, avoiding the heart and lungs so that death would come only after hours of unbearable suffering. When the spike emerged from his shoulder, the crowd gasped in horror. Suleiman was raised upright, impaled like a grotesque display. His own body now the spectacle that all of Paris had come to see. The hours that followed were a nightmare stretched across time. Suleiman, writhing on the pole, gasped for air, blood dripping down the spike as his body sagged under its own weight. The pain was relentless, but his consciousness clung stubbornly to life. Each breath was a labor, each movement a torment, and yet he did not die quickly. The crowd watched as the hours passed, some turning away in disgust, others unable to look away from the morbid scene. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view, while women covered their mouths in horror. For Paris, this was more than punishment. It was theater, a lesson in power, and a demonstration of what awaited those who dared to strike at the French state eventually. After what seemed like an eternity, Suleiman's body could endure no more. His strength faded, his screams grew weaker, and his eyes rolled back as life slipped away. The executioners, satisfied that justice had been served, left his body displayed on the spike for hours longer, a warning to all who passed by. Only after his corpse had been reduced to silence did they finally remove it, discarding him as though he were nothing more than a refuse. The young theology student from Aleppo, who had dared to strike a mighty empire, ended his days in agony beyond comprehension. But the story of Suleiman al Halabi did not die with him. His execution raised questions even among the French themselves. Many whispered that impalement was too cruel, too barbaric, for a nation that prided itself on being the beacon of enlightenment. The guillotine was supposed to be swift, humane, and equalizing every man, no matter his crime, receiving the same quick fate. Yet Suleiman's death was deliberately different, designed to send a message across the world that France would crush its enemies with merciless force. The paradox was glaring. The same nation that spoke of liberty and reason had resorted to medieval savagery to punish a man who dared to resist its colonial power. In the Middle East, however, Suleiman's memory lived on in another way. He was remembered not as a criminal, but as a martyr who sacrificed himself in the struggle against foreign occupation. His assassination of Kléber became a symbol of defiance, proof that even a humble student could strike at the heart of an empire. Over the years, poems were written about him, stories passed down through generations, painting him not as a villain, but as a hero who gave his life in resistance. His grave in Cairo became a site of quiet remembrance, a place where people whisper prayers for the young man who defied France. Today, Suleiman al Halabi's story still echoes with meaning. It reminds us that history is full of contradictions. The so-called age of progress and reason was not free from cruelty. Even in the heart of modern Paris, in the year 1800, a man could be subjected to one of the most brutal forms of execution ever conceived. His death demonstrates how power, when challenged, often resorts not to reason but to fear, using the body of the condemned as a spectacle to maintain control. Suleiman's end was gruesome, but it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Beneath the banners of enlightenment and progress, the shadow of barbarity never truly disappears. The impalement of Suleiman al Halabi remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of execution. It was not simply about punishing a man for murder. It was about demonstrating dominance, crushing dissent, and terrifying any who might dare to follow in his footsteps. And yet, in their attempt to erase him through suffering, the French authorities only ensured his immortality in history. His act of defiance and the terrible price he paid for it are still remembered centuries later, a haunting reminder of how far the reach of cruelty can extend. When justice is entwined with vengeance, his final moments, suspended on a spike before the eyes of thousands, continue to whisper across time, telling us that power and brutality are often closer companions than civilization likes to admit.